Good morning. I'm Scott Litkey from the Institute for Holocaust Education. Welcome to our monthly third Thursday Lunch and Learn. This is now, as I said last time, we're starting into our sixth year doing this, but we actually
Mhm.
started it in November of 2020. We are honored today to have with us our friend Suzanne Horwich, who's the consulting curator from the Goldrich Family Foundation Sofia Davidson collection. If you have not seen the artwork, and if you're local, the exhibit, part of the exhibit, 39 pieces of it are up in our the Eisenberg Gallery, and it will be up here until the 28th. And joining us is Dr. Helen Pankowsky, the granddaughter of Sofia Davidson. And together Suzanne's going to do an introduction, and then we're going to turn it over to Helen, who's going to talk about the Davidson collection, the Sofia Davidson collection, the powerful work and enduring role of Holocaust education through art. So I turn it over to you, and I'm going to put myself on mute.
Good morning,
Suzanne.
everyone. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Suzanne. As Scott said, I'm the consulting curator. I have been working in and out of this project for probably about 12 years when the work was given graciously by Helen Pankowsky's family to the Goldrich Family Foundation. There were steps that had to be taken to preserve the work, document the work, frame the work, wire the work, build crates for the work. And the work is currently stored in a shipping container when not on tour in a climate controlled facility in Aspen, Colorado. And for those of you who joined me at the exhibition last week, thank you for joining again. We're so lucky today to have Helen, Sofia Davidson's granddaughter. She's going to share her memories of her grandmother's paintings, and we're going to learn more today about the actual work and the stories behind the work. So I turn it over to you, Helen, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This means a great deal to me. Um, my grandmother, Sophia Gutentag Davidson, was a very prolific artist. We had her paintings as part of our life since I can remember. And she painted a wide range. And I'm going to be talking about that today because I think that when we look at her body of work as a whole, we can see a story unfolding, which is personal, but at the same time, it's a collective story because it really becomes a story about a life that's been disrupted, and the resilience that can come from that, and how it was all expressed through this medium of art that my grandmother was just so brilliant at being able to capture and convey. So I'm going to put on my share so that we can see while I speak with you.
Perfect.
Are we good? Wonderful. So this is my grandmother, Sophia Gutentag Davidson. It was in this photo was taken in one of the few times that she exhibited publicly. She did not do that very often. She painted for herself. She was born in Lodz, Poland, and her family was a normal Polish family. She was very interested in art from the very beginning and ended up studying in Zurich and in Munich and became part of a group of Jewish artists that were called the young Yiddish artists. Chagall was part of this cohort, And they encouraged each other in how they experimented in art form. So she lived her life as an artist, was a professor of art. And I would like to tell you a little bit about her story through the paintings. And I love beginning with this one because this painting is the only one that she did that is a memory of her childhood. This depicts her childhood home. And so I always like to start with this painting. It shows her mother at the piano, her father on the couch, her grandparents sitting, her sister, her uncle playing the violin. And what is so interesting about this painting, and I'll use my little pointer here, is that she depicts herself here as just a little wisp. And you really get that feeling of memory, of wistfulness for this life that was so suddenly left behind and lost. So she had her life in Poland. She married, her first marriage was to an elderly, distant relative. And whatever happened there is a bit of a mystery, but she then ended up marrying my grandfather. And I show this painting because it is a time in Poland pre-war when protests could happen in the street. My grandfather, depicted right here, Simon Davidson, was part of the Buntist movement, a very socialist movement in Poland. And they would do demonstrations on the street very freely. He was very involved and engaged with that. Now, the way I know some of the stories that of these paintings is she was very quiet and eccentric. She really only painted. But periodically, she would take me by the elbow and take me to one of the paintings hanging on the walls and suddenly just describe why she painted every element in the painting. And for some reason, I guess my own interest in art, I remember, and I remember verbatim what she said. And so this is part of what I will be sharing with you and how I know the paintings. Now, everything that we see of her work were paintings done after the war. Prior to the war, she painted in oil, but she also did sculpture in ivory, enamel. Her work was very broad. All of that was lost. And during the war, she became very, very depressed and did not paint for a long time. Now, their story is documented in my mother's autobiography, East of the Storm. They had a very interesting way of being able to live through World War II and the Holocaust. My grandfather, I always felt that it was intuition. My grandfather just knew it was time for him and my uncle to go. And they left, making arrangements for my mother and grandmother to come later by getting them false papers with identities that were false identities. They attempted several times to leave and were unsuccessful. And finally were able to. And the way I have heard the story is that shortly after they finally left with this Polish man and their false identities, the Gestapo came for my grandmother because she was an intellectual and a professor. So they barely escaped. And they escaped to Russia. And they were able to hide in Russia for the duration of the war. So even though my grandmother painted images of the Holocaust, she herself and her immediate family were not in the ghetto or in concentration camps. So in this painting, some of you may be familiar, I guess we all are, with the story of Fiddler on the Roof, the story of Tevye. And this painting is very poignant to me because we know that the story of Tevye is exactly the story that we are witnessing in my grandmother's life. That is a life that is very settled and comfortable, which is suddenly disrupted, and that leaving home. And this painting, which is one of the ones that she told me about, is telling that story of having to leave home. So, what she told me about this painting is first, I draw your attention to these trees that are thorny and without leaves. This is a motif that we see many times replicated in her work. And what she said to me about it is that it represents the force that is coming and that cannot be overcome. It is too powerful, and it's taking over everything that is familiar and safe. And in this painting, Tevye is saying goodbye to his daughter. He is being evicted by his friend, this Russian soldier. They have been friends all their lives. But now, because it is the Russian who has to evict the Jew, he is standing with the papers, ashamed to look at what he has to do. And so he's holding the paper in front of his face so that he doesn't have to see it. The cat is in the window representing the reluctance to leave and that feeling of this is home and this is where I belong. And then she told me that the sunflowers are facing away because they are so grieved and sorrowed by what they have to witness. They don't want to see it. Again, this is one of 4 etchings that she did, and we're very fortunate to have the original copper plates. In this one, you can see very vividly the motif of the trees that I was speaking about. And if you look closely, there's almost human-like figures within the trees. This is very common when she uses this particular motif. This painting is the Warsaw Ghetto, the Lodz Ghetto, rather, or what became the ghetto. And I draw your attention to the gray tones. When she first started painting in Mexico, many of the paintings had this gray and kind of somber feel to them, which is something that can be seen in her paintings. And then we see how they changed over time. This is a very important painting of hers. It is a synagogue that was burnt. She and my mother were in the school across the street when they saw this happening. And what was going on was that the Nazis were filming a propaganda film, and they forced the Jews to throw gasoline on the synagogue and light it on fire themselves. And in this way, the propaganda film was saying, look, even the Jews are burning their own synagogue. And again, you can see the trees. This painting is the only one of its that she did like this. To me, it is one of the most raw and passionate depictions of the violence and the horror of war that is consuming all of life. Here in the center is depiction of just normal life, while all around it, everything is burning and being destroyed. As I said, they escaped into Russia, my mother and my grandmother. It was a harrowing experience. And along the way, they witnessed this, which is the Nazis forcing the Jews to dig their own graves. There's many stories of that my mother wrote about their experience in Russia. Among them was they had come to interrogate my grandmother. There had been some sort of contest for a poster in a school, and my grandmother, who was an artist, had, done her thing with it, and they didn't like it, so they were bringing in for interrogation. And she just kept staring at, I guess, the commandant, and kind of looking at him and looking at him. And he finally said something. And she said, "You have such an interesting face. I would like to paint you sometime." And she was able to, she was released after that. So we can speculate that that is probably what saved her. This is another of in the series etchings that she did, and it depicts the concentration camp, um, probably Auschwitz. Again, she never was there, and yet we can see how beautifully she captured the pathos and the tragedy of this. And so I want to tell you about this painting. Um, Again, this is one of the ones she talked a little bit about. It is probably one of the most important paintings she did, because not many artists captured the story of this man. It depicts the story of Janusz Korczak. Now, this was a pen name. He was a pediatrician, a children's book writer, a very well-known and beloved figure in Poland. He was known to the Germans as well, and had worked with them, and was very well respected. And among the many things he did, besides his children's books, was to start and to manage orphanages. And in this painting, she's telling the story of one of his orphanages that was targeted to be sent, all the children were sent to Treblinka. And he opted to go with them. Now, the Germans said, "You don't have to go." Even when they arrived there, there's stories that say that they gave him a way out. They say, "You don't need to be here. We will let you go. You can, go back to your life." And he stayed with the children. He made sure that when they left the orphanage, they were all cleaned and dressed, and they had a toy, and they had books. He had made it look as if they were going to be on an outing, and entertained them on the trains. They sang songs, they told stories. And he accompanied them all the way to the gas chamber. And that is what this painting is, telling the story. And what I think is so beautiful that my grandmother did is you can see that the fire of the gas chamber, she painted almost as a halo around his head. He truly was a remarkable person who she commemorated in this way. So they were able to escape. They were in Russia, and someone recognized my grandfather. They lived in a small cooperative, and they were hiding. They were hiding for several years while the Nazis invaded Poland. And someone recognized my grandfather and went to denounce him. And the story goes that that is when the Nazis came to invade Russia. And there was so much chaos that my grandfather and my grandmother, my mother, and my uncle were able to escape. And they made their way back to Lodz, to their home, where they went to their apartment and they could see their belongings. They knew it was their belongings. A Polish person opened the door and said, "No, we are living here. You can't come in." And they became refugees. So my grandfather had a brother in the United States, but there was a quota at the time. And so they could not come to the United States. But being very resourceful, they were able to fly out of Europe and they went to Mexico. My grandfather, as I said, was very resourceful, very clever. In the days of a phone booth, they arrived in Mexico. They had nothing. He found a phone booth. He got a telephone book and he started calling names that were Jewish in the phone book. Now, he spoke Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. So all he could do was speak Yiddish. And he would call these people and tell them, we're here, we need help. And finally, eventually, he got in touch with the person who was actually helping Holocaust refugees. And so that is how they were able to finally get established in Mexico. Now, as I told you, my grandmother was very, very depressed and did not paint. But they did not have anything. And my grandfather arranged for a commission. And the commission was this painting of the just iconic Mexican gladiolas. So my grandmother painted it, and happily for us, the people who commissioned it never picked it up. They didn't want it. And so we had this as the very first painting that she started to do after the war. Clearly, she was captivated by Mexico at this time, which would have been, my goodness, the 40s, the 1940s. This painting, which Suzanne alluded to, is my absolute favorite because it is my memory. Every Sunday in the famous Chapultepec Park, the indigenous people would come to sell flowers. It was a flower market. And from the balcony of our home, I could look and see this exact scene. And so it's a very special painting to me. And she painted many versions of this image. And as I said, she was clearly very captivated by Mexico, and particularly the indigenous images of the people and the flowers. This was another one that she did of calla lilies. And she painted more and more and started to paint the interior synagogues. This is one of the few paintings that she submitted for as in a juried exhibit in Mexico. She won the grand prize. But it's so interesting to see how her perspective is not really a true perspective. And so we begin to see these elements that are almost more Chagall-esque that were of her time. Now, what's interesting is that she began to paint synagogues and religious themes, even though she herself had never been raised religious. Remember, she and her family lived a very assimilated life in Poland. And it was only because they were Jewish that they were persecuted, lost all of this. And so later in life, I find it very interesting and telling that she began to paint much more Jewish themes. So among the themes were the Jewish holidays. Now, my grandmother had 3 grandchildren. It was myself, my brother, and my cousin. And so when she painted these large paintings, she would do them as a trilogy so that each one of us would have our own painting. We wouldn't necessarily get it at the time that she painted it. She would hang on to it, and then for an occasion, she might give it to us. So when she would paint these paintings, on the back, she would indicate who it was for. So this painting is one of the trilogies of the Jewish holidays. This was my painting. And she told me that one of the things she wanted to do here was show the different faces, the different ways that the religious men were expressing their love of the Torah. This is Simchas Torah. And we see it again in this painting, which was Yom Kippur. In this one, she did tell me to pay attention of the expressions on the face. One is looking very lovingly and tenderly, almost personally, at the Torah. The other has great reverence, and his eyes are closed. He's more spiritually. And this one is looking to the heavens and feeling that sacredness. And she wanted me to see that these are 3 different expressions of love for the Torah. This painting was one of the only ones I ever asked for. It's the death of Moses, and I just thought it was so beautifully done. Moses here is an old man, the angel of death looking at him, waiting for him, while he can only see the promised land from the distance. And I want to draw your attention to the Star of David motif that we're beginning to see in her design, in how she constructs the paintings. She went through a period of time where she incorporated this in many, many of the paintings that she did. I'll show you another in a moment. But it began to take form in these in her paintings, and she did this for quite some time. again, in trilogies, this is, I remember her words exactly. She wanted to do this trilogy of three Jewish men who affected their epoch. And that was her word that she used. The three men were Marx, which was my cousin's painting, Einstein, which was my brother's, and then I will show you mine in a moment. But before I do, I want to draw your attention to this painting of Einstein, which to me is so beautiful. We see the trees that we already come to know as that symbol of force, of war, of especially fascism for her. We see Einstein's atom bomb in the background, while he is just simply looking at us playing his violin, and his famous formula is on the board. So this was one of the paintings. The other, which was my painting, was Columbus. Now you have to realize she did this painting um, I think in 1980s. And here she's showing us Columbus as a Jew who is looking not as his ships in the harbor getting ready to sail to the Americas or wherever he's going to discover, but to the ancient promised land. We see the Ark of the Covenant. We see words in Phoenician or Aramaic. And that is what he has his eyes on. And I thought this was so curious when she first did this. Like, where on earth did she get this idea that Columbus was Jewish? And yet, it was just in the last few years that DNA testing actually showed that Columbus was a Sephardic Jew. So I love this as an example of how her mind it kind of lived in a different realm. She seemed to have an intuitive grasp of things that were not necessarily obvious at first sight. And I think that was one of her genius, brilliance in as an artist. This painting is one that depicts her fascination with the 17th, 18th century wooden synagogues in Poland. And I remember the books that she was studying, and she was really fascinated with these synagogues, and she painted many, many in the collection. But what was of interest in this one was that it hung over my mother's piano for many years. And, it was just one of the paintings in the house. And one day my mother decided to change the lighting and to put more of a painting spotlight on top of the painting. So she mounted it and turned it on. And when she turned it on, we were left gasping, because what we saw that we had never seen before was this glow inside of the synagogue. And we had never realized how brilliant she was in her use of paint to depict light. It was as if someone had lit the light inside. We see it again in this painting of Shabbat celebration, where the mother is lighting the candles. And you can see the glow of the candles on her hands, on her face. And again, it allowed us to appreciate this aspect of my grandmother's art that we had just never realized in living with the paintings on our walls. She did a series of religious themed paintings, so biblical stories of this one is of Ruth. And it's a particular beautiful one for many reasons. For one, when she moved to San Antonio, um, her colors got brighter. I think maybe it was the type of paint. I don't know, but it just seemed that the paintings got much, much brighter. They came to San Antonio. They were already well in their 80s. My grandfather, who I have already said was very resourceful, he was still working in Mexico well into his 80s, and he was still chasing down the buses in the busy streets of Mexico to get to work. And my mother had said, okay, that is enough of that, and brought him to the United States. And just as a side story, because he has his own interesting story to tell, he came here and he wanted a job, but nobody was going to hire an 86-year-old man from Mexico. So he went to the University of Texas at San Antonio library and told them that he would catalog a Yiddish library for them. And so for the next several years, that is what he did. And he created a world-class Yiddish library. My grandmother only painted, always. There was always the smell of oil paint and turpentine in their homes. And finally, this painting, which she did in San Antonio, depicts my mother's backyard. And you can just see how it's just a peaceful, homey picture. Our dog, the cactus, the flowers, the cardinal. This was very much my my parents' home where I did a lot of growing up. But even then, this is also a painting that she did during that time. We see that this tree shows up again. And I think it's a statement about how the resilience is there, the perceptions change, but the effects linger well into the lifetime. And as I said, she just painted, and this is one of the ones she left unfinished. It was to be Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, and we can see the beginning of the construction of it, but she never was able to complete it. And finally, I show you this portrait. I love this portrait of my grandmother. She and my grandfather were taking their evening walk around their apartment on the streets around in San Antonio. And a woman stopped them and said, I would love to paint you. And she did. And I feel like this portrait just captured my grandmother so very well. The depth in her eyes and that little smile that kind of always looked like, I know something. um, she just had that look. This was her expression. And so this is what I have to share with you. I will stop sharing now, and anybody that has questions, I'll be happy to answer. I hope that gives you a glimpse into this remarkable artist and the legacy that she left us, which is such a rich way for us to continue educating on the Holocaust, and very poignantly, very timely. It's just a story we have to continue telling over and over again in whatever ways we can.
Helen, thank you so much. I have a couple questions I'll start with. One is, how did these paintings then end up with being a part of the Goldrich Foundation and then being made available?
Yes, I love to tell this story because honestly, I've always felt there's no coincidences in life, and there's like Beshevet, right? It's like fate. So we had attempted to find a home for the paintings many years ago. Oh gosh, close to 40 years ago. At the time, I had a young child, and we mounted an exhibit for the director of art at the McNay Museum here in San Antonio, Texas. And he said it's fabulous, it's amazing, but we can't do anything until it's all cataloged and taken care of. Well, I couldn't do it. I was the only one that could have done it, and I couldn't. So most of the paintings, especially the very difficult ones to look at, ended up in my closet. They were distributed between my brother, my cousin, and myself. So it was a very, very large collection. I revisited this whole idea of we need to find a home for these paintings as my parents got older. And I realized they can't stay in my closet. They're going to end up in the dump or somewhere. And so once again, we contacted director of the art museum. And this time they said, we have a woman in San Antonio who might be able to help you. She has a gallery. Her name's Farrell Greller. So we got in touch with her. She fell in love with the collection. She called it the Pankowsky Project, attempted many, many times to find homes throughout the world for these paintings and couldn't. But she spent summers in Aspen, and she met Melinda Goldrich. And she told Melinda about the collection. And so Melinda said, okay, I'll come to San Antonio, take a look at them. We were very, very excited. I have an office that is separate from the home, and we emptied the office. We mounted an exhibit for Melinda. Our hope was she would take the ones that you saw, the burning of the synagogue, the concentration camp. But we included the religious, the Mexico, we included everything in order to tell a complete story. And she saw the collection and came back in, and we were wooing her. We really wanted her to take these paintings. And she said, I will take them all. It was a very, very difficult decision for my mother and I. My brother had passed by this time. I had his paintings. And the more we talked about it, the more we realized you can't predict what the next generation is going to want. They may not love these paintings like we do. They may not want them. So, what is going to happen to them? And we made the decision to donate them, the entirety. I think it was I don't know if Suzanne is still on here, but 150 paintings. It's a huge collection. And Melinda took them, she restored them. They were painted on very cheap canvas. As I said, they didn't have anything. So my grandfather, just in order to keep my grandmother okay, would buy very cheap canvas. She herself would mount it on very cheap frames, paint. They were falling apart, and Melinda restored them, cleaned them, reframed them, created the crates. And when we saw the first exhibit mounted, and especially in Krakow, when they were exhibited there, I remember coming off the elevator, and here were hundreds of people. I mean, there were so many people who were looking at the painting, strangers. And I could see the expressions on their face. And I knew we had made the right decision, because now the paintings had a legacy. They were going to endure, and they had the capacity to continue telling the story that needs to be told. So that is how they ended up with Melinda. And we were very, very fortunate to be able to go, my mother and I together at the beginning with the paintings. She would tell her story, and then I would share what I have shared with you today.
Thank you. Steve, Steve Weiss had a question with it. I think that answers most of it. The other part of it is, Steve, Suzanne Horwich is the consulting curator for this exhibit and is now booking it in other places. So from here, it's going to, I forget, either it's North Carolina or I think it's South Carolina. And that's what's happening, hopefully into the very long future, that it'll be exhibited in other places throughout the country. Larry Rafo, good to see you.
Your Excellency, Mr. Lickey, I'm curious how the IHE plans to use the exhibit.
Well, we used it as far as in November, we always have the gallery is ours to use. So we had last week, we had an opening as far as people from the community to see it. There also was news coverage on it, so that's being used that way. And then also through through this Lunch and Learn. And the exhibit has been, people have come through and have seen it. And we're very honored that Suzanne brought this to us. Again, we know that there's over 150 of paintings. Suzanne picked out 40, well, actually 39 that would fit into our space. So
are schools interested?
We have let people know, but field trips have not been, that has not happened that way. It's been geared more towards the adult public.
We have done this presentation for the school district here in San Antonio, and it can be done for children. Mm-hmm.
There were just to like within the collection of paintings, they're all amazing. There were some that we felt that just because of the visuals in them, that because we do have young people a lot younger than the age that we start Holocaust education, walking through the building. But the whole collection was shared with me, and Suzanne picked out which ones we were going to use.
Well, that's very impressive. Outstanding work. Outstanding.
It's as Helen and I were talking beforehand, the ability to tell these stories, and especially now as our survivor population is changing, but to be able to tell it throughout these other means are just amazing. Other questions? Well, Helen, I want to thank you very much for sharing the story of your family, these paintings, and the personal stories behind it. We're extremely touched that you were able to be with us. And again, we are thankful that your family made these public so that others will learn from the story. I want to make note that today, November 20th in 1945, that the Nuremberg trials began. So that's a point of, if anyone wants other information about the Nuremberg trials, please contact me. I'm happy to share with you some information we have. And I want to invite you all to come back next month in December for Idan Zakai, a member of our community, who is going to, and also an expert, a Holocaust expert from his training in Israel and the Ghetto Fighters Museum in Israel, an amazing presentation on resistance. And I want to just ask Helen to show the book that we have that was on her, the family story.
Is it showing up backwards?
No, it shows up fine. Is it
Okay.
is it available on Amazon or anything like that? I have a copy.
I think it is. We gave actually, in order to help maintain the exhibit, we gave all the rights to Melinda, to the Goldrich Foundation. So if it's not available on Amazon, it's available through her.
Great.
But it's a fascinating story because we hear a lot of Holocaust survivor stories, but this is unusual in that they went to Russia and they really were able to survive there. And how they got there, and it's just a remarkable story. It's also, my mother also was documented by the Shoah Foundation. If you really are interested in hearing her entire story, you can go to their website and listen to her testimony.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That I'm sure is very interesting. And I'm glad that for research purposes and for other that her story has also been documented.
Yes, yes. Thank
Well,
you so much for
it's
inviting
truly our
me.
honor and pleasure. And to all of us, a happy Thanksgiving, and more importantly, a wonderful Hanukkah. Hanukkah will be done by the time we meet next time, but I hope that we all have a wonderful month, and I will see you all next month. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very
And thank you
much.
very much, Helen.